Good day and welcome to Big Bad Tech. I'm your instructor Jim Pytel, and today's topic of discussion is wind turbine yaw systems. Our objective is to examine the yaw system found on a modern industrial wind turbine. We'll identify the hardware found in yaw systems and discuss the general operational principle. This lecture presumes the viewer has watched the Introduction to Industrial Wind Turbines and Wind Turbine Hydraulic Systems, yaw and rotor brake lectures, both available at the Big Bad Tech channel. The same housekeeping rules cited in the aforementioned lectures apply to this same lecture. Notably, it is presumed the viewer brings with them a necessary foundation in electromechanical technology and an understanding that this lecture must necessarily limit itself to a simplified representation of a yaw system schematic and will not explore manufacturer-specific implementations for every turbine that ever has or ever will be constructed. Related to this qualification, we will explore only general representations of the decisions made by the controller rather than real-world programmed instructions. Long story short, always consult the operations manual for the specific turbine of interest. This being said, you should find some commonalities between the simplified yaw system as presented in this lecture and most modern industrial wind turbines. Let us begin. Viewers will recall that the act of yawing a wind turbine rotates the nacelle relative to the tower, thus maximizing the rotor-swept area exposed to incoming wind, thereby contributing the efficient conversion of wind power to electrical power. The wind turbine nacelle sits on top of the tower, on an externally or internally toothed slewing bearing, allowing the nacelle and tower to mechanically rotate relative to one another. Yaw motors, affixed to the nacelle bedplate, mesh with the slewing bearing via a gearbox intermediary. When energized in one direction, the yaw motors turn the nacelle clockwise. When energized in the other direction, the yaw motors turn the nacelle counterclockwise. Once in position, as we'll soon learn how this is determined, the yaw motors are de-energized, the yaw brakes applied, the rotor brake released, the blades are pitched to an appropriate angle, and the turbine is free to get busy making power. Beyond maximizing electrical power output, by pointing the rotor into the wind, the yaw system also minimizes off-axis mechanical loads and contributes to the long lifespan of the drive components. Lacking a yaw system, or employing one that worked poorly, a wind turbine would be extremely inefficient in converting wind power to electrical power, if it worked at all, and might fail prematurely due to excess wear. Necessary components of a basic yaw system include inputs, actuators that produce some output, and a control system which manages output based on input conditions. Since this particular lecture places special emphasis on motor control and control theory, before we look at a yaw system schematic, it's perhaps worth a moment of our time to quickly refresh our understanding of basic motor theory, reacquaint ourselves with some basic motor control elements, notably switches, sensors or transducers, rotary encoders, circuit breakers, motor starters, contactors and overloads, and lastly, quickly introduce closed-loop control. Motor theory. Viewers will recall that three-phase AC creates a rotating magnetic field when applied to the stator of a three-phase AC motor, where the speed of the rotating magnetic field, the synchronous speed, is directly proportional to excitation frequency and inversely proportional to the number of pole pairs per phase. Additionally, viewers will recall that the rotational direction of the stator rotating magnetic field can be reversed by swapping any two applied phase sequences. For example, if L1, L2, L3 establishes clockwise rotation, L2, L1, L3 establishes counterclockwise rotation. More on interlocks and reversing circuits in a moment. Lastly, a squirrel cage induction motor is a common industrial three-phase AC motor that requires no connections to the rotor. When operating at the rated condition, a squirrel cage induction motor exerts a rated torque, rotates at a rated speed, and draws a rated amount of current. When subject to conditions above the rated condition, current draw increases, which constitutes an overload. Temporary overloads are permissible, but only become a problem if they're sustained for any length of time. Additionally, a squirrel cage induction motor can experience a large but temporary surge of current known as inrush when energized from a dead stop. Thus concludes your review of motor theory. That was 10 lectures compressed into 3 sentences? Like I said, this lecture necessitates you show up with a background in electromechanical technology. Presuming you're still with me, let us now review basic motor control hardware. Motor control. One of the most basic principles of motor control is the division between pilot and primary level power. Pilot level power is low voltage, low current, low power used to directly control the function of the system, whereas primary power is high voltage, high current, high power actually used to do work. At a basic level, high power primary devices only function at the request of low power pilot level signals. Pilot level. You will recall switches are digital devices that can exist in one of two mutually exclusive states, deactivated or activated. For example, consider a normally open limit switch that, when unperturbed and not struck by some physical object, sends a 0-volt signal to the control system. If, however, the rocker arm, roller switch, or wobble stick, yes, this is a true term, attached to the limit switch is struck by some physical object, the normally open limit switch closes and sends a 24-volt signal to the control system. In this capacity, the limit switch offers a clear and defined transition from one state to another. Is something there, or is something not there? A sensor or transducer, in contrast, measures something and outputs a voltage or current signal proportional to the measured quantity. Consider a 0 to 10 volt rotational position sensor capable of measuring 0 to 360 degrees. At 180 degrees, or halfway there, the position sensor would output 5 volts. At 270 degrees, or 3/4 of the way there, the position sensor outputs 7.5 volts, and so on. These analog signals can be used by the control system to perform certain actions at certain input conditions and be displayed or recorded. A special class of rotational position sensor is known as a rotary encoder, of which there are two main types, incremental and absolute. One type of incremental rotary encoder is known as an AB encoder that uses two tags or two sensors, A and B, slightly offset from one another, such that when the sensors receive A, then B, it means it's revolving clockwise. If, however, the sensors receive B, then A, it means it's going counterclockwise. Beyond rotational direction, AB encoders also include a third signal, Z. You'd think it'd be C, but it isn't. It's Z. The Z, or index signal, happens once per revolution and serves as a way of determining an absolute position from the last full revolution. The number of AB pulses since the last index signal can be used to determine rotational position with a desired degree of accuracy. Common implementations of incremental rotary encoders on industrial wind turbines might take the form of a tooth gear that meshes with the yaw ring and rotates the specified number of turns per full turn of the yaw ring, or a pair of offset magnetic proximity switches that count the teeth of the yaw ring directly. Some turbine manufacturers use more than one incremental encoder method, one is primary and one is backup, and can signal a yaw error if the two systems disagree. More on yaw errors in a moment. An absolute encoder, in contrast, produces a unique digital code for each distinct angle of the shaft, where absolute encoders with more bit positions allow for finer and finer angular resolution. Absolute encoders for a yaw system would be kind of an overkill. Most of the time you'll see yaw systems making use of incremental rotary encoders. Primary power. Let's now discuss motor control elements that interact with primary power. You'll note some of these devices only make or break connection to primary power at the request of low power pilot signal. Fuses are elements that melt open and stop current flow when they detect a surge of current above a certain value. In this capacity, they are a means of protecting the load and electrical distribution system from damage in the event of a short circuit or other undesirable fault. Fuses are non-reusable protection elements. Circuit breakers, in contrast, are essentially switches that open and stop current flow when they detect a surge of current above a specified value. As with fuses, they are a means of protecting the load and electrical distribution system from damage in the event of a short circuit or other undesirable fault. Circuit breakers, in contrast, are reusable protection elements. A contactor is a means of making and breaking connection to primary voltage. When the coil of a contactor between A1 and A2 is energized by a low power pilot signal, the primary contacts L1, L2, and L3 to T1, T2, and T3 close. Contactors may also include one or more auxiliary contacts rated for pilot level voltage. In this case, a normally open auxiliary contact from 1.3 to 1.4, which can be used as indicators about a particular contactor status, form electrical interlocks, or other functions. An overload is a sensory device that protects a motor from sustained high current conditions above the rated value. I say again, an overload is a sensory device only. When an overload detects high current in excess of a specified value for a specified length of time, the overload does not open, but rather the overload tells the controller an overload is occurring, and the controller de-energizes the contactor coil, which opens the contactor and stops the motor. Again, contactors have the responsibility of making and breaking connection, whereas overloads detect sustained high current, and they tell contactors when it is necessary to open to protect a motor. Overloads often have a pair of pilot level rated contacts, one normally closed and one normally open, that can be used to determine the status of the overload element. Contactors and overloads working in combination are known as motor starters. Motor starters contain two necessary elements. One, a means of making and breaking connection to primary voltage, the contactor, and two, a means of protecting a motor from sustained high current conditions, the overload. A commonly available motor control element, known as a manual motor starter, combines the function of a circuit breaker, contactor, overload, and manual shutoff. You know the schematic symbol for a manual motor starter includes contacts that can be opened manually, as well as in the event of a short circuit or overload. Some manual motor starters, not all, may include an accessory means of locking them in a particular position as part of safe work practices should it be necessary to de-energize a particular branch of a circuit. Lastly, since some yaw systems do not warrant the inclusion of hydraulic brakes, I should mention that there exist spring-applied electric release friction brakes that are sometimes mounted right on the motor or alternately on the nacelle frame. You'll recall we examined spring-applied electro-release friction brakes extensively in the motor control playlist. You may see the brake coil of these devices illustrated in the primary schematic of some wind turbine systems. This particular lecture presumes the turbine is making use of hydraulic brakes. Control theory. Lastly, automated systems often rely on closed-loop control to ensure the output of the system meets expectations. Here is a very quick summary of closed-loop control. There are numerous terms associated with closed-loop control systems that differ from industry to industry, and I've found it easier to refer to them as what you want and what you got. The key feature of a closed-loop control system is continuously comparing what you've got with what you want. If what you've got is equal to what you want, don't mess with it. If what you've got is less than what you want, go get some more. Finally, if what you got is more than what you want, get rid of some. Notice the diagram shows a sensor measuring the output of the system, i.e. it's measuring what you've got. And this value is fed back to something known as a comparator, which, as the name implies, compares the measured value of what you've got with what you want. Notice the polarity of the signs for the comparator. Consider cruise control offered in some modern vehicles. This is a form of closed-loop control. When a driver enables cruise control at 55 miles per hour on a car going 55 miles per hour on a smooth level straightaway, the cruise control keeps the gas pedal where it's at. By comparing what we've got, 55, to what we want, also 55, the comparator subtracts what we've got from what we want and generates a third signal, error. In this case, what we've got equals what we want, so the error is 0. With 0 error, the controller doesn't need to adjust the system. If, however, the car starts climbing a hill, the present throttle position might not be sufficient to keep the car going at 55. Let's say speed drops to 53. By comparing what we've got, 53, to what we want, 55, our error signal is positive 2 miles per hour. Note the sign. What we've got is 2 miles per hour under what we want, and the error signal transmitted to the controller is telling the controller to get 2 miles per hour more. The controller adjusts the throttle sufficient to accelerate the car, and speed stabilizes at 55 miles per hour, such that we're back to a condition where what we've got is equal to what we want, with 0 error. Conversely, if a car starts going downhill, the present throttle position might be too much to keep the car going at 55. Let's say speed rises to 58 miles per hour. By comparing what we've got, 58, to what we want, 55, our error signal is minus 3 miles per hour. Again, note the sign. What we've got is 3 miles per hour over what we want, and the error signal transmitted to the controller is telling the controller, get rid of 3 miles per hour. The controller backs off the throttle sufficient to decelerate the car, and speed eventually stabilizes at 55, such that we're back to a condition where what we've got is equal to what we want with 0 error. Now realize this automated adjustment does not happen instantaneously, and there is some rise, fall, and settling time and over and undershoot that can be accounted for with some not so trivial math. We'll explore closed-loop control in greater detail in later lectures. For now, this should be sufficient for the purposes of this lecture.